Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Kenneth Bianchi. The Hillside Strangler, which was later found out to be a pair of cousins working together, were Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. The two were charged and convicted for harming and taking the lives of 10 separate women together, with Kenneth taking the lives of 2 others on his own. After an extremely intensive investigation and the arrest of the two, Kenneth began trying to set up an insanity defense. He claimed dissociative identity disorder. He blamed his alter ego Steve for the horrific multitude of crimes. Luckily, however, a court psychologist, Dr. Martin Orne, observed him and his behavior and found that his claims were untrue. After being presented with this finding, Kenneth agreed to plead guilty and testify against his cousin in exchange for leniency on his sentence. He still ended up being sentenced to life in prison, while his cousin got a sentence of life in prison without parole. While Angelo had a heart attack and passed in 2002, Kenneth still remains in prison. In our number 9 spot today, we have Charles Cullen. This guy used to be a nurse who took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through subsequent interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40, he just couldn't remember the names of them all. But, of course, he could remember the details of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October of 2003, when a patient at a hospital passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only 1 count of his crimes, but he just ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continuously asked the judge to step down and apparently repeatedly chanted, "Your Honor, you need to step down," for 25 minutes, even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts. It is thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly unbelievable. Charles was sentenced to 18 consecutive life sentences and will be eligible for parole in 2403, so let's hope he doesn't make it that long. In our number 8 spot today, we have HEBERT MULLIN. Okay, I'm a true crime fan, and the more I learn, the more that being a person living in California in the 1970s seems like a terrifying experience. Like, seriously, there were so many horrible, some of the worst serial killers who were active in the state at this time. I don't know how anyone got any sleep or did anything. Hebert is just one of the many who were active at this time. It is said that Hebert, before his crime spree, was quite bright and well liked. He was voted most likely to succeed in high school, but by his mid-30s, his life had taken a dark turn, and he was now a serial killer who would go on to take the lives of at least 13 people. To be perfectly honest, Hebert definitely had some mental illness struggles that greatly contributed to his horrific crimes that he committed. That does not excuse what he has done, but it would be completely unfair to not mention that part of the story. Experts have explained that Hebert suffers from paranoid schizophrenia, and he believed that his crimes were preventing earthquakes in California. He only believed this sort of fantasy more after his arrest because coincidentally, there were no earthquakes in California during his crime spree, but there was one shortly after his arrest. In 1973, he was sentenced to life in prison, and although he has been up for parole a number of times, he has been denied every single time, with the next hearing taking place in 2025. In our number 7 spot today, we have Luis GARAVITO. Luis gained a nickname from the media of the Beast, and I think that's a great indication of the nature of his atrocious crimes. He is said to be one of the worst serial killers in the entire world, and it is believed that his victim count is up in the 300s range, which is absolutely shocking. He confessed to 147 crimes, and he was found guilty on 139 of those counts, which puts his sentence at 1,853 years, but here's the thing. This trial took place in Colombia, where he lives, and there is a law which puts the maximum sentence to 30 years. He was sentenced in 1999, meaning there's only a few years of this sentence left. He also had years taken off of his sentence because he assisted police in the search to recover some of the victims' bodies, which means that just next year, in 2023, he is eligible for parole. According to Luis himself, he committed these crimes because he had made a deal with the devil, and he explained that satanic ritual was involved in all of his crimes. In our number 6 spot today we have Randy KRAFT. More commonly known as the scorecard killer, this monster is thought to have tormented and then taken the lives of 16 different young men from 1972 to 1983. Most of his crimes were committed in California, and he most often would pick up his victims as they were hitchhiking near military bases. The reason for his nickname is because of this strange and sinister list he had that had cryptic references to each of his victims. Based on this list, it is thought that he may have taken the lives of more than 50 people, which is beyond disturbing. When Randy was finally caught, he was pulled over by the police, who, when they went around to the passenger side, discovered the body of a 25-year-old Marine who would become Randy's final victim. Randy has been sitting on death row at San Quentin for over 25 years for these crimes, and despite his conviction and death sentence, and the gruesome discovery on the day he was caught, Randy still maintains his innocent plea. Something's telling me he just might be lying. In our number 5 spot today we have Dennis Rader. The BTK, whose real name is Dennis Rader, was one of the worst serial killers from 1974 to 1991. He left taunting letters for police and newspapers where he described his crimes, but thankfully, this annoyingly large and misplaced ego is what led to his demise. After a 10-year hiatus on his disgusting crimes, he couldn't keep his mouth shut, so he began communicating with the media again in 2004. This communication, combined with his lack of knowledge on how technology works, led to his arrest in 2005. During his trial, he didn't apologize for his crimes, but he did describe them in full detail, which is horrifying and extremely eerie. I could not even imagine having to be there during that. After his trial, he ended up being sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years. When Rader was first arrested, when the police were taking him to the station, an officer asked him, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" To which he replied, "Oh, I have some suspicions why." In our number 4 spot today we have Gary Ridgway. This horrible human being is also sometimes known as the Green River Killer, and his crimes took place somewhere between 1982 to potentially as recent as 2001. He was convicted for 49 crimes but confessed to an unbelievable 71, which makes him the second most prolific serial killer in the United States in terms of confirmed killings. Most of his victims were either sex workers or women in vulnerable circumstances, and through DNA profiling evidence in 2001, authorities were able to connect him to 4 of his crimes. From there, they made a deal with him where they would spare him the death sentence in exchange for the disclosure of the location of all of the missing women. Gary took the deal and was spared the death sentence, and instead was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Not only did he say that he chose the type of victims he did because they were, quote, easy to pick up, and that he, quote, hated most of them, but he also called his crimes his career. So, do with that what you will. In our number 3 spot today we have Rose West. Rose West is an English serial killer who committed her crimes alongside her husband. He definitely also would make a spot on this list, but he decided to take his own life in 1995 after being arrested while awaiting trial. Really strong stand-up man. The terrible pair were investigated and subsequently arrested for taking 9 lives together, with Rose receiving an additional charge for another 10th life. During the court proceedings, against the advice of her counsel, Rose decided that she would testify herself, and what a trip that was. During her testimony, she sometimes was very tearful and dramatic, but of course, an act like that can be hard to keep up, so other times she was just cracking jokes and laughing. Imagine doing your tight 5 while you're on trial for the worst of the worst crimes. Luckily, it seems as though the jury hated that as much as I do, because they came back with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all 10 crimes. Get this, in prison, Rose West met Myra Hindley, which if you don't know who that is, she committed a bunch of very similar crimes with her husband, boyfriend, partner, whatever as well, and the two became besties, and they even had an affair throughout the whole thing. Rose is still trying to say that she was totally innocent and that Fred was completely responsible for all of the crimes. Also, to make the story even crazier, for those of you who watched part 1 of this series, the number 1 spot on the last one, her name was Joanna Denny. Well, Joanna was in the same prison as Rose, and in 2019 she threatened to kill her. Because of this, they had to move Rose secretly to another location because there was a very real threat to her life. In our number 2 spot today we have Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski is most often referred to as the Unabomber due to the atrocious crimes that he committed. He was known for being quite bright from a young age, and it is believed that he had an IQ of about 167. He was accepted into Harvard at the age of just 16, and he went on to receive a PhD. At 25, things were still looking bright for the guy as he landed himself a job as an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley, but just 2 years later he resigned from that position and his life took quite a drastic and dark turn. In 1971, it is said that Ted moved to a remote cabin in Montana that had no electricity or running water. From 1971 until 1977, Ted learned to live a hermit, off-the-grid lifestyle while learning different survival skills, but once 1978 rolled around, he was ready to start his terror campaign. From here until 1995, he began a nationwide bombing against people who were involved with modern technology. He planted these weapons or would mail them, and in the end took the lives of 3 people and severely injured 23. Just like many of these kinds of people, his own ego and delusions got in the way, because on April 24th, 1995, he sent an anonymous handwritten letter that was addressed to the police via the New York Times. His own brother ended up recognizing his handwriting, however, and that's the tip that he gave to the FBI. Ted was then captured, tried, and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. In our number 1 spot today we have Christopher Scarver. Okay, Christopher is a little different than the others on this list, and if you're unfamiliar with his story, you'll soon find out why. Basically, on June 1st, 1990, Christopher showed up at the Wisconsin Conservation Corps Training Program office, and there he demanded money from the man he found. When the man only gave him $15, Christopher went on to shoot him. Christopher then went and demanded money from another man and continued to shoot the man he had already shot until this second man gave him money. Christopher was caught and convicted for this horrible crime, but the story does not end here. On November 28, 1994, Christopher was assigned work detail with 2 other inmates. One was Jesse Anderson, who had taken the life of his own wife, and the other was none other than prolific serial killer and monster himself, Jeffrey Dahmer. Well, when the 3 were left alone, Christopher took a bar from a piece of equipment in the exercise room and used that to basically beat and kill the other 2. I'm not gonna lie, there's no excuse and no reason for any of the crimes these people committed, including these ones, but there is a very weird sort of poetic justice to that. Christopher was tried again for these 2 crimes and received 2 more life sentences. Apparently in 2012 it was announced that he wants to write a tell-all book about the killing of Dahmer, which is definitely bizarre, but we'll see if that ever comes to fruition, I guess.
Starting off this countdown we have Donald Harvey, aka the Angel of Death. Donald Harvey is a nurse turned serial killer. So he was working in a hospital as a nurse and was secretly killing off his patients. To him, he was doing them a favor. He thought that his chronically ill patients needed a relief from the pain, so he would smother them with pillows or would poison them or let their oxygen tanks run out. It's believed that he took the lives of over 70 people. However, in 1987 he was only convicted for 37 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life plus 20 years. In March of 2017, Harvey was beat up badly by a fellow inmate. He passed away shortly after.
In our number 9 spot today we have Warren Jeffs. Warren Jeffs is the president of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints and is also serving a life plus 20-year sentence, which is exactly where he should be. His father was once the president of the cult, but when he passed, the position was passed on to Warren. As the new leader of the polygamous cult, he said that no one should even attempt to marry one of his father's widows, but just a few days later he himself married all of them except for 2 because one refused and then was banned from ever marrying anyone ever again, and the other ran away. If your marriage proposal causes someone to flee the cult that they're in, you're clearly not a very good person. Warren had the power to assign who would marry who, but he was also able to punish a man by taking his wives and children and assigning them to another man. As a man, you had to have at least 3 wives in order to get into heaven, they say, but the more wives, the more likely it would be that you got into heaven. In 2005, the Texas authorities conducted a raid and took legal custody of 416 children after someone called in and tipped them off about all of the horrible things that were happening at the ranch. In 2006, Warren was arrested for being the worst and is still serving his sentence. There is so much more to this case that we don't have time to cover, but there was a documentary released recently called Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey, which I would fully recommend if you want to know more about this horrible person. In our number 8 spot today, we have Tex Watson. Tex Watson was one of the central members of the Manson family, which was led by Charles Manson, and he was a willing participant for the horrible Tate and LaBianca crimes that took place on August 9th and 10th, 1969. If you don't know about them, you can look them up, but just a warning that the events that took place on those nights were horrible, gruesome, and insanely unnecessary. In October of 1969, Tex knew his arrest was coming, so he fled to his home state of Texas, but was later arrested and extradited back to California. Once he was in California, he refused to talk or eat and ended up losing 55 pounds, which got him sent to get tested to see if he was fit to stand trial, which he was. In 1971, he was convicted on 7 counts related to the killings that happened on those terrible nights. He originally received a death sentence, but it did end up being commuted to life in prison. But get this, you guys, he was able to release a book while in prison, and he got married, and through conjugal visits he was able to have 4 children. Thankfully, in 1996 they banned those kinds of visits for people serving life in prison, and in 2003 he did get divorced because his wife had met someone else, which, like, yeah, I would hope so. He also apparently is now a devout Christian, which is just interesting. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Golden State Killer. If you have any interest in true crime at all, you have most definitely heard of the Golden State Killer, as he was one of the most famous serial killers of all time, and he managed to elude police for 30 years. From 1973 to 1986, the GSK was responsible for taking the lives of 13 people, harming 50, and 120 different burglaries all across California. Throughout the investigation process, he used different tactics to both taunt and threaten police and victims, which is just on another level of messed up. If you don't know how this story ends, buckle up because it is absolutely wild. So you know those family DNA tests, like those 23andMe things where you send in your DNA and then they send you back your genealogy? Well, basically these services helped identify who the real GSK was. In 2018, when Detective Paul Holes, shout out to MFM if you know you know, and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer uploaded the GSK DNA profile that they were able to obtain from the crime scenes to the website GED Match, they were able to find 10 to 20 people who had the same great-great-great-grandparents as the match. From there, a genealogist made a large family tree, and then they were able to single out 2 main suspects. After covertly connecting DNA samples from one of the suspects and comparing them to the crime scene DNA, they were finally able to arrest Joseph James DeAngelo, who is the Golden State Killer. After decades of waiting, the victims of his crimes were finally able to see justice served, as he was sentenced to 12 life sentences plus 8 years. He was spared the death penalty because he admitted to numerous crimes he had perpetrated, some of which he wasn't even being charged for. He is now 75 years old, and he will most certainly spend the rest of his life in prison. In our number 6 spot today, we have James Holmes. James is the man behind the 2012 Aurora, Colorado shooting that took the lives of 12 people and injured 70 others in the Century 16 movie theater. Shortly after the crime spree, he was arrested and held without bail while he awaited trial on an accepted plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. I just want to make it clear in this case that insanity doesn't apply to every mental illness, of course. James was and is severely mentally ill, but the court has the job of deciding whether or not that illness made him unable to tell right from wrong. That's what the defense had to prove. Things were admitted to the court, such as his notebooks and journals, as well as testimony from 2 separate psychologists who spent 22 and 25 hours with him, and both diagnosed him with a serious mental illness, but both also stated that in their professional opinion, he knew right from wrong. After a really tumultuous trial, he ended up being found guilty. The jury could have given him a death sentence, but on account of his illness, they decided that that would be inappropriate, so in the end instead he was sentenced to 12 life sentences without parole and in an additional 3,318 years. In our number 5 spot today, we have Charles Ng. Charles' story really starts off shortly after he moved to the United States on a student visa. He dropped out after his first semester, and soon after after he was involved in a hit-and-run accident. He then tried to avoid prosecution by enlisting in the United States Marine Corps using false documents that stated his birthplace was within the United States. He was later arrested by military police a year later for stealing automatic weapons, and then somehow he escaped custody, headed back toward Northern California, and this is where he met Leonard Lake, who is another real piece of work. Charles did end up going away and serving a bit of time, but it was only 18 months and he was back with Leonard, and that is when the two started their crime spree together. It is believed that together the pair took the lives of somewhere from 11 to 25 different people. When Leonard was caught and brought in for questioning, he sneakily took a cyanide pill he had hidden in his jacket and took his own life, but Charles ended up standing trial. He was convicted for 11 of the killings and he remains on death row at San Quentin. In our number 4 spot today we have Paul Bernardo and KARLA Homolka. This is a double whammy because unfortunately both of these people are still alive, but at least one of them, Paul, is still in jail. This horrible pair are often referred to as the Ken and Barbie killers, and while Paul started off living a life of crime, he quickly brought KARLA into it as well after their meeting. That is not to say she is not just as guilty as him, however, because they are both fully responsible for their own actions. While Paul was arrested for a multitude of crimes, the pair were arrested and convicted of taking the lives of 3 separate people, one of them being KARLA's own sister. See what I mean about them both being responsible for their own crimes? They both suck. The investigation into the crimes proved to be quite difficult, with authorities having plenty of hoops to jump through, and this is why a plea deal was created for KARLA. She had 1 week to accept or decline the deal, which would give her a sentence of 12 years for her full cooperation. She accepted. Both were convicted in 2005, and Paul was up to apply for parole in 2018, and in October of that year he was denied. His next parole hearing was just over a year ago on June 22nd of 2021, and it took only an hour of deliberation to decide to turn down that application as well. I personally think 30 seconds probably would have been enough to decide, but I'm just glad the outcome was the same. KARLA, on the other hand, served her 12-year sentence and then was released. Like, years ago. She moved away from Canada and headed to Costa Rica for a while with her new husband and children, if you can believe that, but unfortunately she has since returned. In our number 3 spot today we have EDMUND KEMPER. EDMUND KEMPER is an American killer who was convicted for taking the lives of 10 people, including his paternal grandparents, as well as his own mother. It is said that he is noted for his height, as he is 6 foot 9 inches, and for his intelligence, as he apparently has an IQ of 145, but I personally think he is most notable for being an absolute monster. His first crime took place when he took the lives of his grandparents, and after this crime he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spent time in a hospital before it was determined that he was rehabilitated and he was released at the age of 21. After his release, he unfortunately went on a spree where he would target young females who were hitchhiking. After his final crimes, he ended up confessing and turning himself in, which is something we really don't see all of the time. When asked in an interview why he confessed, he said, quote, "The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time." 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined and observed him and found him to be legally sane, and thus he was able to stand trial. On November 8th, 1973, the jury deliberated for just 5 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty. He has been eligible for parole since 1979 and has been denied every time he applied, one time saying, quote, "Society is not ready in any shape or form for me. I can't fault them for that." He is eligible to apply for parole again next in 2024. In our number 2 spot today we have Stephen Griffiths. This is a person who is said to have idolized the Yorkshire Ripper, so I'm sure what comes next will be no surprise. Stephen was a PhD student who wanted to achieve fame, but through the most sinister way possible. Between June 2009 and May of 2010, he would go on to take the lives of 3 separate women. His criminal history was also extremely concerning, as years ago he had been arrested due to an unprovoked attack on a grocery store manager, and it is said that he previously stated that he saw himself becoming a serial killer. Shortly after he was arrested for his crimes, CCTV footage emerged that shows him celebrating after taking the life of his final victim. The footage showed him holding up a crossbow and giving the finger directly to the camera. It is said that Stephen pled guilty to his crimes once caught, not because he was remorseful, but because he wanted to receive the recognition for them. In our number 1 spot today we have JOANNA. This is a person responsible for a series of killings and attacks that took place in March 2013. JOANNA is a very cold and heartless person and has, on many occasions, been said to laugh at her crimes and the lives she took, even still behind bars. After the first of her crimes, authorities launched a manhunt for her and they used CCTV footage to help track her down. She was finally caught after attacking 2 dog walkers who, thanks to immediate medical intervention, were able to survive. There are many things about this story that make it exceptionally chilling, and it seems as though most people Joanna encounters are left with quite an impression of what a horrible person she is. On the day she was sentenced, it is reported that the judge, Mr. Justice Spencer, said, quote, "Although you pleaded guilty, you've made it clear you have no remorse." He went on to say, quote, "You are a cruel, calculating, selfish, and manipulative serial killer." After this, he sentenced her to a whole life order, or life in prison without parole, and it is said that she smiled and laughed at this. Since her time in prison, she is said to have planned escape attempts that involved the killing of a prison guard and other terrifying ideas. Starting off at our number 10 spot, we have Scott Lee Kimball. This is a man who took the lives of at least 4 people between the years of 2003 and 2004, but I say the words "at least" because although it's never been able to be proven, it is thought that he actually took the lives of somewhere around 20 plus people. During the first of his 2 crime-filled years, Scott actually worked as an FBI informant, but to none of our surprise now, he was one of the worst informants of all time. Not only did he rarely provide any sort of evidence that actually ended up being useful, but much of the evidence he provided ended up later being proven false. He was caught in 2006 not only for these horrific crimes, but many others as well, which included things like fraud and forgery. He ended up being sentenced to 70 years in prison, and he is still currently serving that sentence.
In our 9th spot, we have Albert DeSalvo. Albert DeSalvo, better known as the Boston Strangler, took the lives of 13 women between 1962 and 1964. He would strangle these women with a piece of their clothing before taking advantage of them. In January of 1967, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. A month later, him and 2 other inmates actually managed to escape from prison, and a full-scale manhunt ensued. Thankfully, it wasn't long until he was recaptured. However, in 1973, Albert was stabbed to death by another prisoner. In our 8th spot, we have Ronnie McPeters. Now, Ronnie McPeters has actually been deemed too insane to execute. So Ronnie was first arrested after taking the life of a 27-year-old woman. The woman, Linda Marie Baltazar, was running errands when Ronnie came up to her window while panhandling. She shooed him away and he left, but he ended up coming back and shooting her. He was first placed in jail for his crime and then placed in the rubber room. But that didn't stop him because he was known to set fires in the jail and harass other inmates. So they moved him to San Quentin prison where he was awaiting death row. And that's when he started acting even crazier. Apparently he would attack other prisoners and guards, and was known to smear his feces all over his cell and even himself. This behavior got him off of death row. They literally thought that he was far too troubled to be executed. In our 7th spot, we have Mark Chopper Reed. Mark Reed is an Australian criminal who lived a life of crime. He was known to rip off drug dealers, as well as he would kidnap and torture members of the criminal underworld. It's believed that he was responsible for the death of 19 people and the attempted murder of 11 others. In fact, the movie Chopper is based off of his life, and it's a wild movie. The things he would do were insane. For example, he had a fellow inmate cut both of his ears off so that he could leave H Division and be transferred to a different wing. He also once played Russian roulette with himself. Who does that for fun? In our 6th spot today, we have Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the most famous serial killers in the world. People all around the world know of him and the sadistic and disturbing crimes that he committed. From 1978 to 1991, Jeffrey murdered and dismembered 17 male individuals. What he did afterwards was even more disturbing. He would keep some of the body parts as souvenirs, even take photographs of the deceased. When police searched his home, they found it littered with human remains. Dahmer was finally arrested on July 22nd of 1991. However, while in prison, there were multiple attempts on his life. On November 28, 1994, an inmate, Christopher Scarver, finally succeeded at taking Dahmer's life. His reasoning behind this? Well, apparently Dahmer was known to taunt others in prison. He would do this by making his prison food look like severed limbs to taunt the other people. He would even drizzle ketchup on top of his blood. Christopher and others found this very unnerving, so he decided to take action against him and beat him to death. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Jason Barnum, aka better known as Eyeball Man. And that's because he literally has a tattoo on his eyeball. Like, he tattooed it completely black. If that doesn't speak volumes about who he is, then I don't know what does. He also has one side of his face tattooed to look like a skull. So not only does this dude look like a scary prisoner, but he is one. This dude has a long list of crimes under his belt, including possession of heroin, first-degree attempted murder, first-degree burglary, and third-degree felony in possession of a weapon. In fact, he was sentenced to 22 years in jail after shooting a police officer. Moving on to number 4, we have NIKKO Jenkins. This guy is one of the scariest inmates in the world. Some say he's the craziest inmate in the world, and you're about to find out why. One time, he killed a man just because he stared at him the wrong way. Not only that, but in court, Jenkins was known to speak in some weird language. He said he used this language to communicate with an Egyptian serpent god, and this god was the one giving him orders to kill people. He also enjoyed talking about the people he killed and smiled the whole time while doing so. In the end, he was convicted for killing 4 individuals. Moving on to number 3, we have Damien Fowkes. In 2002, Damien Fowkes was sentenced to 12 years for a series of armed robberies that he had committed. But while in jail, he committed even more crimes. In 2010, he attempted to kill another prison inmate. He made a DIY shank by melting a razor blade onto plastic cutlery, and he used it to slice a guy's throat. As a result, he was transferred to a higher security prison. But that did not stop him. A year later, he killed an inmate by strangling him to death with strips of his bedding. These attacks gained him the title of being an extremely dangerous prisoner. In our second spot today, we have Alexander Pikushkin. Alexander is a Russian serial killer who wanted to complete the number of squares on a chessboard by killing 64 people. It's said that he has killed around at least 49 individuals and possibly as many as 60. In fact, he was inspired by another serial killer, Andrei Chikatilo, who I have talked about before. In his mind, he wanted to compete with him and kill even more individuals than Andrei did. Now, what I find the weirdest is when Alexander was young, he was said to be such a kind and sociable child. That was until one day when he got struck in the head by a swing. From then on, his whole demeanor completely changed and he got really aggressive. So they think that this accident turned him into a serial killer. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Pedro Rodrigues Filho, aka the Brazilian Maniac. This guy is a Brazilian serial killer who claims to have taken the lives of 100 individuals. He started killing at a young age, one of the first kills being his father. He apparently killed his father with a machete, cut out his heart, and then chewed on it. He also has been known to kill and torture a number of gang members. He did this all before he was 18. He was arrested on May 24th of 1973, during which he was placed in a car with another criminal who he killed for no reason. And while in prison, he went on to kill more people. It's said that he took the lives of 47 inmates in jail alone. Pedro served 42 years in prison before his release in 2018. Yes, he killed that many people and then he got released.